Hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here for this program. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Minnesota's gangster history from the safety of wherever you're watching this program. So with that in mind, let's begin. My name is Chad Lewis, and I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But it wasn't until the early 2000s when I was working on a book in my home state of Wisconsin. I was up in the Northwoods when my car popped a tire. So I got out to fix the tire, worked up a nice little thirst. I looked over and there was a lodge right in front of me. So I thought I'd drop in and grab a can of pop. Well, lo and behold, the place was called Little Bohemia. I didn't know it at the time, but it seemed as though fate had stepped in and provided a little detour from things that go bump in the night to things that will bump you off. And that's what you're going to see today. The program, the research, which eventually became the Minnesota Road Guide to Gangster Hotspots, and the program you're going to see today. And I really want this program to be a time portal back to the days when the gangsters robbed our banks. They kidnapped our citizens. And they mowed down everybody who got in their way. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour back to the days of the gangsters' hideaways in Minnesota. Now, of course, the gangsters themselves, they no longer hang out at any of these locations. Many people believe the gangsters simply moved their headquarters over to the Capitol building in St. Paul, but that's a different presentation altogether. But even though the gangsters are no longer there, the buildings are still there, the history's still there. But for how much longer, I don't know. I always encourage people to go to these places while you still can, because every year we're losing more and more of these historic treasures. So with that in mind, put on your zoot suit or your flapper dress as we explore the gangster history of Minnesota. The first question we have to ask is, what was it about Minnesota that the gangsters loved? Why did they come to the state so often? There were several reasons you'll learn about today, but the most important reason was because of one man, this man, Police Chief John O'Connor. He was the police chief of St. Paul. And while every other community at the time was trying to keep criminals out of their cities, O'Connor took a different approach. He actually invited crooks to the Twin Cities. If you were a crook from anywhere in the country, you could go to St. Paul, register with the police, and do whatever the heck you wanted. Prostitution, no problem. Gambling, be our guest. Except there was one catch to this. You couldn't do it in the city of St. Paul. If you wanted to go to Willmar, Minnesota and rob their banks, which we will see they did, you were free to do so, but there'd be no crime inside St. Paul. Therefore, in the 1920s and 30s, there were more crooks living in St. Paul than nearly anywhere else in the world. Yet it was safer for you to live in St. Paul than nearly anywhere as well. They had such a tight, close grip on the gangsters. In fact, so many criminals were hanging out in the saintly city that noted bank robber Alvin Creepy Karpus once commented that if he hadn't seen a buddy of his in a while, he immediately thought of one of two places, prison or St. Paul. If his buddy wasn't locked up in one of them, he was probably hanging out in the other one. And when I say there was no crime in St. Paul, I meant there was no crime against normal people. No crime against everyday citizens. Crimes against other gangsters, well, that was okay. Such was the case of America's first car bombing, December 4th, 1928, in St. Paul, West 7th Street, home of this gentleman, Dapper Dan Hogan. Dapper Dan got his moniker because he was always so smartly dressed. And he had his hands in everything in the Twin Cities, both legitimate businesses and not so legitimate businesses. And one day when Dapper Dan went up to go to work, he went out to his garage, started up his vehicle, and a bomb blasted the car out of the driveway into the alleyway, broke off the steering wheel, smashed out the engine, smashed the car windshield. But Dapper Dan wasn't immediately killed in the bomb's blast. The reason being is that he was a very large man. And in order to accommodate his girth, he had a seat all the way back as though he was sitting in the back seat. So when the bomb went off, he didn't get the full effect. He was rushed to the hospital. Dozens of people lined up willing to give him a blood transfusion. But here's the odd part. When Dapper Dan came into the hospital, one of his legs was nearly blown off. But when they offered him pain medication, he flatly refused. The reason being is that Dapper Dan thought he was going to survive. And if you're in the business of keeping secrets, like Dapper Dan was, you might not want to go under pain medication either, not knowing what you would tell the authorities while on the effects. So he refused all medications. But it was all for naught because Dapper Dan did die from his bomb blast. The case was never officially solved. They didn't care, just another dead gangster. As you saw, Dapper Dan's house is still there. The driveway's still there, the alleyway, the new garage is there. You can see it all for yourself. Just make sure there are no bombs under your vehicle when you go looking for Dapper Dan Hogan. Out of all the gangsters I researched, I had the most fun researching and the most trouble researching this gentleman, Lester Gillis, better known as George Babyface Nelson. I had the most trouble with him because you never knew what side of Babyface was going to show up. On the one hand, those who knew him said he was a polite, well-mannered, jovial young man. He was also perhaps the best connected gangster in history. If you needed an introduction to a fellow crook, he could provide it. A safe house? No problem. A gun for your arsenal? He could do it all. And at a time when all of these gangsters had numerous mistresses, the malls as they were called, Babyface was said to be very devoted to his wife Helen and their 2 young children. But before you start thinking of Babyface as some type of angel, remember I said there was a flip side to him, and that flip side was his anger. Many of his own colleagues refused to work with him because they never knew what his anger was going to make him do. Unfortunately, when he came to Minnesota, they got to see both sides of Babyface. First stop, October of 1933. Babyface and his gang at the time, which was made up of his good pal John Paul Chase, Tommy Carroll, and Homer Van Meter, scoped out the First National Bank. They had been there upwards of a week scouting it, making sure they knew the ins and outs of the bank. So on the morning of October 22nd, they wanted to make a withdrawal from the First National Bank. In fact, they wanted to take every penny the bank had. So they gathered around and they waited for the morning maintenance man to come in on his daily cleaning routine. That's when they put a gun to his ribs at the door and said, "We're robbing the place, let us in." Well, the maintenance man panicked. He said, I can't. I don't have the keys. He lied to them. They said, "Like hell you don't. We've been watching you open this the last 7 days." Somewhere with that gun pointed in his ribs, he found those keys and let him in. They all went inside except one lookout. We don't know who, but one of the lookouts was standing outside. Witnesses recalled seeing a man with a brand new suit with brand new bib overalls on top of the suit, carrying a basket out in front of the bank. They would have thought it was much weirder if they had seen his weapon inside the basket. Today the place is now an antique store, but the footprint hasn't changed. So the gangsters simply waited for all the bank employees to come in and threw them on the ground. One of the biggest misconceptions about bank robberies of the era was the whole stick 'em up. Put your hands up. That's the last thing gangsters wanted, because most places had windows out in front. Anyone walking by would see that the people had their hands up and there'd be a robbery. Instead, they threw you on the ground. And that's what they did. Everything was going great. Not one alarm was triggered. That is until one of the bank employees was late to work. And when he came in, for some reason, this aggravated babyface Nelson, who punched him and threw him on the ground and threatened to take his life. A threat Babyface was more than capable of delivering on. At the time, the young man was terrified for his life. Years later, he told the Brainerd newspaper that his claim to fame was getting a sock in the face from Babyface Nelson. Everything was going great. They scooped up all the money they could. Not one bullet was fired. As the gang was leaving, Babyface turned around and said, "The first one of you to stick your head out the door is going to get it blown off." Then, for some unknown reason, Babyface started shooting up downtown Brainerd. Several bullet holes are still in the buildings in downtown Brainerd. As you can imagine, this got the attention of the authorities, who started a search for the gangsters, who were out of the area fast because they had a very high-tech way of getting away from the police at the time. And that high-tech way was that they would have a big bucket of roofing tacks in their back seat. The police, having no two-way radios at the time, couldn't do anything but follow you. So the gangsters would throw these tacks, the police would pop their tires, and the chase would be over. That's exactly what happened on the Brainerd case. But if you ever make your way up to Brainerd to check out the bank robbery, or maybe you want to rob some banks for yourself up there, make sure you stop by the local Historical Society's museum, because there, on display, they have that picnic basket that was used in the robbery. You can go there and see if any of your weapons fall inside as well. Without a doubt, the deadliest gangsters ever to set foot in Minnesota was that of the Barker Karpus gang, made up of Alvin Creepy Karpus and whatever Barker boys were out of prison at the time. You remember Creepy Karpus as Prison or St. Paul. But before we talk about the exploits of the gang, we have to address the legend of the Barker boys' mother, Ma Barker. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this legend. It goes something like this. Ma Barker was this gun-toting mastermind criminal who took her young boys off on a life of crime, leading them to become criminals and killers on their own. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or planning of the crimes. You'll see how Ma Barker's legend began when we catch up with her down in Florida a little bit later. But where Ma lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. Now, what Karpus was doing running with the Barker boys, I don't know. Karpus was thought to be one of the most intelligent gangsters of all time. So why he was chumming around with the Barkers, who, let's just say, were not the most intelligent, maybe that's why he loved them. You might recall this was the gang that in 1933 kidnapped William Ham for the Ham's brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom. Quite a sum of money back then. 6 months later, they took Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune, keeping a $200,000 ransom from him before letting him go. And in 1932, they decided to rob the Redwood Falls Bank. Now, what's interesting about this is that they considered themselves bank robbers, not abductors or kidnappers. They thought that was beneath them. They only did it because it was easy money and they only had to split it 50-50 with the local police and politicians. So they come up on the day of the robbery and they decide to rob the place. Immediately the alarms are triggered. The police start trying to show up to the location. But the gangsters simply started scooping up the money. This is what it looks like in the back of it today. We know exactly what happened during this robbery because one of the witnesses inside actually wrote a letter about her experience inside the building. So what happened was the gangsters pull in, the alarms are sounded, they're starting to scurry the money to the back of the building, putting it into the cars. And in the back building, several businesses were back there. And two of the ladies had their heads out of their shops talking to one another. One of them said, "They're robbing the bank. If I had a gun, I would shoot them." At that moment, one of the gangsters stuck his head out the door and said, "Now, you wouldn't really shoot at me, would you?" Needless to say, those women went right back to their store and did not come out until it was safe. The gangsters simply sped off with all of their money, getting away without any severe damage. Through the years, the building has changed from a bank to numerous businesses, but most keep the night vault and the bank vault still there where you can go and see it all for yourself. The Barker gang also decided they wanted to rob the Third Northwestern Bank in Minneapolis. And it was on December 16, 1932. But there were several problems with this plan of theirs. One, as you can see, the bank had nearly all pane glass windows out front, meaning anyone walking by would see there was a robbery. Second, the building sat on the corner of Hennepin Avenue and Central Avenue, two very busy roads in Minneapolis, meaning somebody was going to come by and see it. But whether the gangsters didn't know this or they didn't care, perhaps they were bored with their lives, even though they were bank robbers, they decided to rob the bank anyway. They had no idea the deadly consequences that would ensue. As you can imagine, as soon as they went in, the alarms were triggered. The police raced to the building. Well, not exactly. You see, back then, false alarms were pretty common. So the police took their time getting there thinking it was a false alarm. By the time they got there, the gangsters were on their way out. They simply had a gunfight and then scurried off, the gangsters taking off for one of their safe homes throughout the Twin Cities. This safe house that they had used for quite a few months was on St. Paul. It's still there. It's on Robert Street. And they were renting this place from a landlady. And the landlady had a son who worked at a speakeasy. And one slow night, he happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when all of a sudden he saw a wanted poster for those supposed musicians living next to his mother. He went down to the police station and said, "I'm here to collect the reward. The Barker Carpus gang's living next to my mother." They put him in a back room and said, "Don't worry, you're going to be a hero. We'll take care of this with one phone call." Unfortunately, he ran into Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Minnesota's history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of the problem with one phone call, which he did. Anyone want to guess who he called? That's right, the Barker Carpus gang. He said, "The feds are going to raid your building. Get the hell out of there." Now, the Carpus gang had no idea that it was this wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Mr. Dunlop. He was an alcoholic, and when he got intoxicated, he often talked about the exploits of the gang. So the Barker boys decided they were going to take him out of Minnesota. It was too hot, he couldn't be there. They wanted to take him on a nice little vacation to northern Wisconsin. But this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of those vacations you don't come back from. They brought him up near Webster in the Siren area to a place called Fremstead Lake. There, on the lake, they shot him several times and dumped his naked body on the side of the lake. They sprinkled a bunch of money on it to make it look like a gang hit. In fact, after retiring, for many years the local sheriff of the time used to go around jokingly saying that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care, it was just another dead gangster. When I dug up Dunlop's death certificate, they had to list his occupation. And this is great because they listed it as unknown, suspected underworld character. Kind of cool occupation to have back then, although it usually meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. Bank robberies were everywhere. If you're ever bored, start digging through Prohibition-era newspapers and you'd be amazed at how many banks were robbed. In 1930 in Wilmer, the Bank of Wilmer was robbed when gangsters pulled up, went inside, ordered everybody to get to the ground. Here's the bank staff recreating how they were able to trip one of the alarms. The police showed up. But the townsfolk weren't waiting for the police to arrive. They started shooting at the gangsters. And a gunfight ensued, something out of the Wild West in downtown Wilmer. People were shot at all over town. Here's a gentleman pointing at one of the bullets going into a booth. This gentleman was upset because his car windshield was shot out. The newspaper said it was a miracle that dozens of people were not killed in the shootout. For years, they had no idea who had robbed the bank. Eventually, it was thought that the bank was robbed by Machine Gun Kelly, Vern Miller, and Sammy Silverman. We believe Silverman was there because a few weeks after the bank robbery, he was found dead near the Wildwood Amusement Park near White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Him and two of his colleagues were dumped on the side of the road. It was thought that they tried to swindle the other bank robbers out of their portion of the money, which was never a good idea. The Wildwood Amusement Park is no longer there, but the road where they were dumped is still there near White Bear Lake. And even though the bank is no longer a bank in Wilmer, the accounting firm that's there does allow people to come and see the original bank vault that they robbed so many years ago. You may have to use a speakeasy password to get in. What's that? What's a speakeasy? Well, speakeasies, if you don't know, were places during Prohibition. Places where you could go and illegally drink, dance the night away, gamble, maybe even partake in one of the ladies of the night that worked at these establishments. And in Minnesota, they were everywhere. They littered the countryside. In fact, you have so many speakeasies in Minnesota that I think in Minnesota, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law. And one of their favorite places to go was a place you can make your favorite place to go. It's in St. Paul. It's the old Wabasha Street Caves. Started out as a mushroom factory, the speakeasy, and then turned into Castle Royale and a few others. Now, there's a lot of legends about this speakeasy. One of my favorite legends was said to have happened sometime in the late 1920s, early 30s. Like all great legends, nobody knows exactly when. Four men were playing cards late at night. The waitress thought it was odd because all of the men carried with them musical instrument cases, although none of them played in a band. She went out to fill up their drinks and to top off their cocktails when she heard the sound of a Tommy gun going off. When she came back, three of the men were on the ground dead or dying, and the fourth man ran out with the Tommy gun. She notified the police. When the police came, they said, "We'll take care of it." An hour later, they threatened to arrest her for wasting their time. They had cleaned up the mess as though nothing had happened. But that waitress said those bodies, they weren't removed. Legend is they were simply buried in the back of the caves where many believe they still are to this very day. But nobody believed this young woman, even though they knew the police were corrupt. Except she had proof. Proof you can see today because above the old fire mantle is the bullet holes, from the original gunfight from the card game Gone Awry. But it was also in 1934 that there was a dance going on at the caves. and a woman was approached to a dance by a stranger. Normally she wouldn't have accepted, but there was something about the man's confidence that intrigued her. She had her dance, and the man and his buddies left. Immediately everyone ran over to her, asking if she knew who she was dancing with. She had no idea. Well, the last person you'd want as your dance partner was exactly who was said to be at the caves. None other than John Dillinger, public enemy number one. If you don't recall Dillinger from 1933 and 34, he was a bank robber, perhaps the most infamous bank robber of all time. He was public enemy number one, and the main criminal the federal government wanted to capture. When Dillinger came to Minnesota, trouble seemed to follow him. First stop, the Twin Cities, the Lincoln Court Apartments. Dillinger and his Wisconsin native girlfriend, Evelyn Billy Frechette, are staying there on the third floor under the guise of being Mr. and Mrs. Carl Hellman. Unfortunately, the rest of the country had gangster fever, including the landlady, who noticed that the men only seemed to leave and come during the middle of the night. They always went out the back door, and they seemed that the shades were always closed no matter if it was day or night. She notified the police thinking they had to be gangsters. The police checked it out and found nothing out of the ordinary. But the next day they went back thinking if it was Dillinger, they didn't want to take any chances. So they went up to room 303 and knocked on the door. Billy, answering the door as much as that chain lock would allow her to, said hello, and they said, "Hi, we're here to speak with Carl." Billy, momentarily forgetting her alias, said, "Carl who?" They said, "Your husband, Carl." Without missing a beat, she snapped right back into it and said, "Oh, he's at work. You'll have to come back this afternoon." They said, "We'll talk to you." Again, she said, "Oh, I'm not properly dressed. I can't talk to you. Come back this afternoon." Well, now they knew something was going on. They sent an officer down to call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, they told Billy they wanted to talk to her. She locked the door, went inside. Apparently, according to her testimony, as cool and calm as ever, Dillinger said, "Pack your bags, we're getting out of here." Unfortunately for the officers, about the same time, a fancy car pulled up out front. Out got Homer Van Meter, Dillinger's right-hand man, a very deadly character. He was heading up to the third floor to see Billy and Johnny. So he heads up and he sees the police are there. Doesn't try to shoot them, doesn't try to fight, simply tucks his head down and walks by them. Finally they say, "Hey, who are you?" Said, "I'm a soap salesman." "Where are your samples?" "He's on the steps now going down." "They're in my car." Finally they figure someone should see who this guy is. So they send someone down, and Van Meter's gone. He jumps out from under the staircase, starts blasting at the officer, who runs for his life, and Van Meter scurries away. Meanwhile, Dillinger opened the door a crack, stuck his gun in the hallway, and started blasting a path to the back door, where he escaped with Billy in their car, and they drove off. The problem was, Dillinger had been struck. Possibly his own bullet ricocheted into his calf. He needed medical attention. But he was the most wanted man in America. He simply couldn't walk into a hospital. Luckily, the upstanding city of Minneapolis had him covered. This is the home of Dr. Clayton May. Dr. Clayton May was a physician by day, mob doctor at night, treating them for their STDs, bullet wounds, and the like. He sees John Dillinger at his door and says, "You're welcome to stay here as long as you want, Johnny." Of course, his price skyrocketed as well. Dillinger stayed there for a couple nights, and then on the third night, in the middle of the night, he took off with Billy down to Indiana, his home state. Somehow, in all that confusion, Dillinger forgot to pay the medical bill. But don't worry, Dr. Clayton May would get more than a medical bill. The feds found out he was sentenced to prison, 2 years in prison, and lost his license to practice medicine for helping Dillinger. Even though under oath at his trial, he broke down crying, saying that if he wouldn't have helped Dillinger, Dillinger would have killed him. which is probably the truth, but the jury did not care. But the gangsters couldn't go on forever. Death caught them, and it caught them very quickly. First stop, April of 1934, the North Woods of Wisconsin, where my car popped its tire. Little Bohemia. It was the off-season, which meant it was completely dead up there. No one was filling the place up like Chicago tourists do today. So when the owner saw a group of fancy cars pull in, and the men got out wanting to rent the place for the entire weekend, money was no object. In fact, the owner said the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. That should have been their first clue, but again, they needed this business. But their excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the front door. Because in 1934, this was a who's who of gangsters that you did not want at your resort. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Homer Van Meter, Three Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, and Tommy Carroll. Deadly, deadly men. If the government could capture these men, they could throw away their most wanted list. Of course, they had the malls with them as well, their softer side. In the beginning, the owners were happy. The men were buying all the rounds, they were tipping really well, they were telling amazing stories. The only thing that bothered them is that all of the men seemed to carry a large bump on the side of their jackets. But don't worry, they would find out what those bumps were. They made this mistake of smuggling out information to Melvin Purvis, who headed up the Chicago division of the FBI. They told him Dillinger was up in the North Woods of Wisconsin. So he flew up to Rhinelander, Wisconsin, drove with many of his deputies, and they drove just south of Manitoush Waters to Voss's Birchwood Lodge. There they were about to make a game plan when they heard that Dillinger was about to leave at any moment. Dillinger had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So they raced to the lodge. Their game plan was to wait for Dillinger to come out and try to shoot him. If they tried to capture him, he might escape and embarrass them once again. So they waited. Unfortunately for them, a little after 9 p.m., 3 local men who had been eating and drinking there decided to go home. Well, the feds panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. So they opened fire on this car, killing one of the men, injuring the other 2. Well, now all hell broke loose at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who was sleeping in the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main cabin, was busy packing clothes when he heard the gunfire. He could have easily come out and snuck into the woods undetected. Instead, he came out guns blazing, and then he ran into the woods. Later that night, he would steal several cars, shoot many people, and kill an FBI agent in the process. Meanwhile, back at the lodge, Dillinger and his men were getting hit with a lot of gunfire. Luckily, none of them were struck, but they started shooting up the entire building. But that gave Dillinger and his men enough time to escape. Well, what was their escape plan? How did they get away? Well, it was this. They simply crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, simply forgot the back door. They had no idea that there was a little valley along the lake that the gangsters ran in through and were not spotted. Tommy Carroll simply hitchhiked his way back to St. Paul. Three Finger Jack, Dillinger, and Homer Van Meter were able to borrow a car at gunpoint and make their way back to the Twin Cities. But because the radio stations in America were running story after story of Babyface Nelson shooting up the Northwoods, they knew it would be too hot to go through the north. So they went through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota. And when they did, they passed over the old spiral bridge here. And one of the officers and his partner saw that their plates were stolen, so they gave chase, which is all they could do. For over 20 miles, they had a running gun battle with the gangsters before Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road and got away. A few hours later, they would find the gangsters' abandoned vehicle. Now, judging by the amount of blood you see photographed here, they believed that whoever was sitting in the front seat of the vehicle would probably die from their wounds. And they were right. Three-Finger Jack did die from his wounds. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the side of the road. Unfortunately, that amazing old spiral bridge is long gone, but they do have a new bridge leading over the river from Hastings. As you make your way into St. Paul, you can recreate the Dillinger escape if you so choose. Imagine the year 1934, the Biograph Theater, you're at the movies, when all of a sudden the guy sitting next to you looks a heck of a lot like John Dillinger. And it was Dillinger. He had no idea he was being set up by a friend of his named Anna Sage. She was Romanian and ran some brothels in Chicago, so she was being threatened with deportation. So she believed that if she turned in the most wanted man, not only would she get the reward, but the government would let her stay here in America. So that's what she did. She turned in Dillinger. And as her reward, the U.S. government shipped her back to Romania. But here's where things get weird. The government explanation is that Dillinger came out of the movies that night, saw the police waiting for him, tried to shoot them and run into this alleyway, but they were just too quick and they shot him and he bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Witnesses that night tell a different version of a well-dressed man being shot practically without warning and dying in the alleyway. Regardless of whether either of those versions are true, Dillinger bled to death in this alleyway waiting for help. Immediately, thousands of people gathered under the Biograph. They got Johnny, they got Dillinger, can you believe it? But they didn't stop there. They went into the alleyway. Now, word of caution here. The next few minutes of the program, you're going to see several of these signs. And that means that something coming up is a bit gory, gruesome, graphic, something you might not want to see. So you can close your eyes. I'll tell you when the slide is gone, but I do not want you contacting me saying, hey, you should have warned me about those photos. So close your eyes if you don't want to see it. Here we go, because this is what the people did in the alleyway. They started dipping their newspaper or handkerchiefs into the blood of Dillinger as a grisly souvenir. When they were finished there, they followed him into the morgue where women cut locks of his hair, they stole blood, and photos of his nearly naked body were taken by curious sightseekers. Okay, photos gone. Now, the Biograph no longer shows movies. It's more of a live theater. It used to, every year on the anniversary of Dillinger's death, you could watch Manhattan Melodrama just like he did at the theater, but they no longer do that. The next to go was Homer Van Meter. Not as well known as Dillinger, but just as deadly. Dillinger and Van Meter met in prison and spent much of their criminal lives together. So it's only fitting that they would both go down in such eerily similar conditions. While Van Meter got his in an alleyway in St. Paul instead of Chicago. University Avenue. He was getting dropped off to buy a car. He had several $1,000s on him in cash to buy his car. But when he got dropped off, the police were there waiting for him. They chased him across the street. He tried to get away, ran into a blind alley, a dead end. Ironically, today it's now a bank parking lot. As soon as he realized his mistake, he tried to turn around and start shooting them. They already had the shotguns out. They blasted him. He flew to the ground, and he was there on the ground, bleeding to death, just like Dillinger. Witnesses who saw it say, much like the true gangster he was, he went to shoot back at them, but his arm had been blown off in the gunfight, and he died waiting for help to arrive. Word of caution, I'm going to show you his photo in that alleyway if you'd rather not see it. Here we go. Here's Van Meter in the alleyway, dead. Or maybe not. Paul Maccabee, in his wonderful book, Dillinger Slept Here, tells the story that the photographer here was late to the scene. They had already taken Van Meter's body away. So he hired someone to lie down under some sheets to recreate it. So maybe this is Van Meter, maybe it isn't, I don't know. Okay, photo's gone. The mystery then became, how did they know he was going to be there? Was it a jilted lover, a jealous gangster, or somebody else that tipped them off? We don't officially know the reason they were there or how they knew he was going to be there, but here's an easier mystery for you to solve. As I said, when I went to buy his gun, or his car, he had several $1,000s in cash on him, well over $5,000. But when the police were done with him and he ended up at the morgue, he had less than $100 in cash on him. Where that money went to, I'll let you decide. The next to go was Babyface Nelson. He was leaving Lake Geneva with his wife and his good buddy John Paul Chase because the feds were there waiting for him. So as he was driving back to Chicago, he saw 2 carloads of feds coming up from Chicago to Lake Geneva. He turned his car off the road, went onto their road, ran one of them off into the ditch, and the other carload he ran off near a park in Barrington, just north of the suburbs of Chicago. There, he got out and started blasting them. They're shooting him, he's shooting them. By the time he reaches their vehicle, he realizes they're in no condition to fire back at him. And with blood oozing out of all the bullet holes in his body, he kicks them out of their vehicle and he drives off. Unfortunately, later that night, both of those agents would die from their gunfight with Babyface Nelson. The next day, Babyface's dead body was found on the side of the road. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. If you'd rather not see it, close your eyes. Here we go. Babyface dead at the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. The last of the big names to go was that of Ma Barker and Fred, the only 2 Barkers still alive and out of prison. They were renting this home down in Florida near the lake. The neighbors had no idea who they were, but they thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They would often give candy out for kids and give rides in their fancy vehicles. But the feds found out who they were. They showed up. According to their version of event, they knocked on the front door and asked Ma to surrender peacefully. Which she apparently said, let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering. Most likely, they opened fire without warning on the criminals. Researchers of the era believe that Ma and Fred were killed in the first 30 seconds of the gunfire. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, the feds opened fire on the house thinking it was the gangsters. It went on so long, neighbors started putting out lawn chairs, watching it like it was some type of reality TV program. Finally, after several hours of no gunfire coming from inside the house, the police finally got the courage together to force the Barkers' hired cook inside to see what was going on. And that's where they discovered Ma Barker was dead, unarmed, and a senior citizen. And they thought perhaps the U.S. public would not like them going around shooting unarmed seniors, so they concocted this story that Ma was this mastermind criminal. Once the story started spreading in the media, those who knew Ma best, including Elvin Creepy Karpus, said that old woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But that's how the legend of Ma and Fred began. Word of caution, I'm going to show you their morgue photo if you'd rather not see it. Close your eyes. Here's Ma and Fred, their bullet-riddled bodies in the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. Now I mentioned how the neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. Even after they found out who they were, they named their local watering hole Ma Barker's Hideaway. You can go there in Florida and take some shots and do some shots if you so choose. But the gangster era couldn't go on forever. It ended very quickly for 3 main reasons. One, obviously the repeal of prohibition. Bootleggers making millions of dollars a year had it dry up overnight. Second reason was the FBI got much better at fighting these men and women. When they started out, most agents were college graduates who had never fired a weapon in their entire lives. But they got much better very quickly. But the third and most important reason was because of us. Back when the gangsters were robbing banks, nobody seemed to care. When they were bootlegging, people cared even less. It wasn't until they started shooting us and kidnapping us that we started turning them in for the outrageous sums of money that were being offered. So what do we make of these men and women? Were they killers, folk heroes, or something in between? That's where I leave it up to you to come to your own conclusion. But regardless of what you make of these men and women, I think what should be celebrated is the history in which they operated. Not only did they change Minnesota history, they changed U.S. history as well. They really were the A-list celebrities of their day. And I think that's what should be celebrated, the time period in which they operated. So with that, I wanted to save a few moments for you to go to my website if you want more information. There you'll be able to find more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I really hope your adventure does not end here watching this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure. And when you do, I think you'll discover some really interesting things. You'll meet odd people, you'll see strange things, and along the way you might just discover that the weirdest thing out there, the scariest thing out there, is often yourself. But you may want to heed the advice of these next travelers, because in Minnesota, who knows what could happen. Don't shoot, I ain't Dillinger. So with that, I'll throw it out that in honor of the library here, I'm throwing together a coupon on my website. If you want any of my books, go to my website, type in the keyword coupon code library, and you'll get 15% off any or all of my books. And I really want to take a moment again to thank the library for having me here. In all my time, I can't recall a period in United States history where the libraries were as important as they are today. With everything going on socially, with the pandemic, politically, libraries are the fabric that holds the community together. They're a real treasure for every community. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me here today, and they should be applauded for that. And thank you.